Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at AI, but through kind of different lens than you might expect.
Oh,
Yeah, we're going to be looking at it through the lens of the humanities.
interesting.
So you might be thinking, like, what does poetry or history have to do with algorithms?
Right.
Which is honestly what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
It's tempting to think about AI as like a purely technical thing, but really AI, it comes from our culture, right? It
Yeah.
reflects our culture and then shapes it in new ways.
Yeah, it's like this big cultural mirror reflecting back at us.
Yeah, and the humanities give us the tools to see those connections more clearly.
Exactly. And to guide us through this, we have an incredible paper by some leading humanities researchers, and they're making a really compelling case that we need to engage with AI on like a deeper, more critical level.
Yeah,
They argue that AI isn't just a tool, it's actually a cultural object.
interesting.
And it deserves the same kind of rigorous analysis that we apply to like literature or art or historical events.
It's like when we look at a painting or read a poem, we don't just take it passively. We analyze it, we interpret it,
Right,
we question it,
right.
and we need to be doing that with AI too.
Yeah, so this is not just about algorithms and data sets. We're
Mm.
going to be talking about meaning, about culture, about how AI is changing the way we see ourselves and like the world around us.
Yeah.
So this deep dive is like your crash course in how the humanities can make you a more informed, more like discerning consumer of all the AI buzz,
I like that.
ready to dive in.
Absolutely. Let's start with this first point.
Mhm.
The researchers make this idea that models make words, but people make meaning.
Okay, unpack that for me. I'm intrigued.
So AI can generate text, no doubt, but
Mhm.
the meaning we find in that text that comes from us humans.
Okay.
We're wired to look for intention and intelligence.
So even though AI can like put words together in a way that sounds like it makes sense, it doesn't really get what it's saying.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, especially with these AI hallucinations.
Oh yeah, everyone's talking about those AI hallucinations. You mean when AI just makes stuff up, but it sounds totally plausible.
Precisely because it's trained to predict the most likely next word, not to understand truth.
Ah, so it's about probability, not like actual understanding.
Right.
Huh.
And that's where the human element comes in.
So we bring our knowledge and our experience and our critical thinking to like interpret what the AI is actually saying.
Exactly. Goes back to what literary theorists were saying in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Thinkers like Roland Barthes,
Yeah.
they were arguing that the author's intention doesn't fully determine a text's meaning.
Interesting.
It's the reader who brings their own interpretation.
I like that.
And it's the same with AI.
That makes so it's like AI gives us the raw materials, and then we as humans use our understanding of the world to build meaning from those materials.
And it really highlights the difference between human and artificial knowing, right? Like an AI system can be trained on massive amounts of data, but they don't understand the data in the same way that we do.
Yeah, it's like the difference between reading a recipe and actually tasting the dish.
Right.
You know, you can have all the ingredients listed out, but that doesn't mean you know what it's going to taste like until you experience it.
Exactly. And the paper gives a great example of this. They talk about a team at the translation lab that was trying to use AI to translate an interview with Ousmane Sembène, the Senegalese filmmaker. And the platform kept suggesting inaccurate translations
Oh, wow.
because it couldn't grasp the nuances of these Twine and Wolof terms used in the original French interview.
So even though the AI had access to all this data, it didn't have the cultural knowledge to actually understand it.
Exactly. And it points to a bigger point, the need for a broader definition of culture in AI research.
Okay, now I'm curious to hear more about that. So what's wrong with the way AI research currently defines culture?
Well, it often uses a very limited definition, focusing mainly on things like nationality or language or ethnicity.
But culture's so much more than that.
Exactly. It's about values, beliefs, traditions, art forms, the whole tapestry of human experience.
So it's like saying culture is just a list of demographic boxes to check off.
And that can be a real problem, especially when it comes to developing AI models
Yeah.
and figuring out what data to feed them.
Right. So if you're only training AI on like a narrow slice of human culture, it's not going to be able to interact with people from different backgrounds.
Right. And it might even perpetuate harmful stereotypes.
That's a good point.
It's like trying to understand the world by looking through a tiny peephole.
Yeah.
You're only going to get a limited view.
So what's the solution? How can we like broaden AI's understanding of culture?
Well, it starts with being more intentional about the data we collect.
Okay.
If we acknowledge that culture is more than just these demographics, then we need to be more careful about the data we're feeding our AI systems.
So instead of just scraping data from the internet, we need to start thinking about specific cultural communities
Hmm.
and how they use language, how they express themselves, what their values are.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about recognizing the data is not neutral.
Right.
It reflects the perspectives and biases of the people who collected it.
So if we want to create AI systems that are fair and equitable, we need to make sure that our data reflects the diversity of human experience.
Exactly.
That's a really powerful point. It makes you realize, like, how much responsibility we have as creators and users of this technology.
Absolutely. And leads to another important question. Can we create AI systems that are representative of all of humanity?
That's a big question. I'm guessing the paper has some thoughts on this.
They do.
Hmm.
And they argue that this quest for truly representative AI is a bit of a red herring
Why is that?
because the idea of representation itself is kind of loaded with assumptions. It suggests that there's this objective, neutral way to capture human
But
experience.
that's impossible, right? There's always going to be some bias, some perspective that gets left out.
Exactly. And this is where the humanities can offer some valuable insights.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think about historians. They're constantly grappling with biased sources. They
Mhm.
can't just debias the past. Instead, they focus on understanding the context in which those sources were created, acknowledging their limitations, looking for ways to fill in the gaps.
So it's not about pretending a source is objective. It's about being transparent about its limitations.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to AI. Instead of chasing this impossible dream of perfect data, we need to be upfront about the limitations of our data sets.
Okay, that sounds like a much more honest and realistic approach, but how do we actually do that in practice?
Well, the paper highlights a few techniques that humanities scholars use. One is called critical fabulation.
Critical fabulation. Okay, that sounds interesting. What is that?
It's basically a way of using creative storytelling to fill in the gaps in the historical record.
So they're making things up.
Well, not making things up, but using informed speculation.
Okay.
It's about acknowledging the silences and absences in the historical record and trying to imagine what might have been said or done.
So it's like using our imagination to fill in the blanks, but in a way that's grounded in research and evidence.
Exactly. And this technique could be really valuable for AI too.
Interesting.
Instead of assuming that our data sets are complete and unbiased, we can use critical fabulation to explore alternative perspectives.
That's a really fascinating idea. It's like we're using our creativity to challenge the limitations of the data.
And this ties into another concept. The paper discusses the null value.
A null value. Okay, what's that?
It's basically a way of acknowledging the things we can't know. The voices that are missing from the historical record, the stories that haven't been told.
So it's about holding space for the unknowns.
Exactly. And it's something to keep in mind when we're dealing with AI, which can sometimes give us this false sense of objectivity and completeness.
Right. We need to remember that the data we feed AI systems is always going to be a partial reflection of reality.
Precisely.
Okay, so instead of trying to eliminate bias, which is probably impossible, we need to be more upfront about the limitations of our data and the choices we make when we use it.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that dataset creation is a subjective act, and we need to be responsible for the choices we make.
Okay, so dataset creation is a political act.
You could say that.
That's a big takeaway for me, and it actually connects to another point. The paper makes this idea that bigger isn't always better when it comes to AI models.
Right. For a long time, the thinking has been that the bigger the model, the more data you feed it, the better the results.
Right.
But the paper challenges that assumption.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's recent research that shows that's not always true.
So there are situations where smaller AI models might actually be better.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And the paper links this back to the idea that complete knowledge is unattainable.
Okay.
No matter how much data we gather or how big our models become, we're never going to have a complete picture of the world.
Right. It's like trying to understand the ocean by collecting every drop of water.
Exactly. You'll just end up overwhelmed.
That's a great analogy. So instead of trying to build this like mythical AI that knows everything, we should be focusing on AI systems that are more specialized.
Exactly. And this is where collaboration becomes important.
Okay.
We need to be working with people who have deep knowledge in specific areas to develop AI that's actually useful.
So we need to combine the power of AI with human expertise.
Exactly. And that leads to another point, that not all training data is created equal.
Now, this is where things get even more interesting. So what does the paper have to say about training data?
It challenges this tendency to view pre-training data as this uniform resource.
Okay.
It's about understanding the unique characteristics of each piece of data.
So it's more than just labeling data as like high quality or toxic.
Right. It's about understanding the historical context, the cultural influences, the nuances embedded in each piece of data.
So it's like we're treating data with the same kind of lens that we would apply to a work of art.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the paper highlights several projects that are doing just that.
Oh,
Yeah, one example is a project that's working with the Hathitrust Digital Library.
I heard of that. That's the one with like millions of digitized books, right?
That's the one.
Wow. Okay, so what are they doing with all of that?
They're creating detailed metadata for each book.
Metadata meaning information about the book.
Exactly. Things like genre classifications, publication dates, authored information details about the physical characteristics of the books themselves.
So they're capturing the whole context of each book.
Exactly. And it allows researchers to ask all sorts of new questions.
Interesting.
Like they can track how literary genres have evolved over time or see how different cultural groups are represented in literature.
That's amazing. So they're not just digitizing books, they're creating like a whole new way of understanding human culture.
And this type of deep contextualization is so crucial if we want to use AI to study culture.
It's like giving each piece of data its own unique fingerprint so we can understand where it fits in the larger scheme of things.
I like that. And the paper highlights some of the ways they're doing this, things like data archaeology, data narratives, and data essays.
Oh, yeah, those sound familiar. Can you refresh my memory on what those are?
Sure. Data archaeology is about digging into the history of a data set, tracing its origins, understanding how it was shaped.
So it's like detective work.
Exactly. Then you have data narratives,
Uh-huh.
which aim to humanize the data,
Okay.
tell the stories of the people and communities it represents.
So putting a human face on the data.
Exactly. And finally, you have data essays, which take a more analytical approach.
Okay.
They explore the broader implications of a data set
Huh.
and engage with questions of ethics and bias.
So it's about going beyond just describing the data and really grappling with its deeper meaning.
Exactly.
Okay.
And these data essays often draw on multiple perspectives and disciplines.
It sounds like they're trying to bridge the gap between data and meaning.
Exactly. And this attention to detail, this careful documentation of data, is so crucial if we want to develop AI that's responsible, transparent, and accountable.
Speaking of transparency, the paper also talks about openness in AI, and it sounds like there's a lot more to this than meets the eye.
You're right. The paper really dives into the complexities of openness,
Okay.
highlighting issues like copyright consent and community norms around data.
It seems counterintuitive, but even open data can be problematic if it's used without careful consideration.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's not a simple yes or no question.
Right.
We need to think deeply about who owns the data, how it was collected, what the potential consequences of using it might be.
Can you give me an example of where openness gets tricky?
Sure, the paper talks about fan fiction communities,
Okay.
where users often operate with an expectation of privacy,
Right.
even though their work might be technically open on the internet.
Right. Just because it's publicly available doesn't mean it's ethical to use.
Exactly.
So we need to be respectful of the context in which data was created.
Exactly. It's about being mindful of the potential harms that can come from using data without proper consent.
Okay, so we need to be having much more nuanced conversations about data ownership and access in this age of AI.
Absolutely. And those conversations need to involve a wide range of stakeholders.
This brings us to another important issue: limited access to the computing resources needed for AI research.
Right.
The paper argues that this actually fuels corporate control of AI, and I can see why that would be a problem.
It's a huge problem. The high cost of computing resources means that only large corporations can really afford to play in this space.
It's like a self-perpetuating cycle. Corporations have the money to develop AI, which requires more money, which further concentrates their power.
Exactly, and it limits the diversity of perspectives in AI research.
Right, so we end up with AI that only reflects the values of a small elite group.
And that's a dangerous path.
Yeah, it's like we're creating a world where only the wealthy and powerful get to decide what the future looks like.
We need to find ways to make AI research more accessible.
So it's not just about who has access to the data, but who has access to the resources to process it.
Precisely. And this connects to the concept of data colonialism, which the paper discusses.
Data colonialism, okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. Can you explain it?
It's the idea that corporations are extracting value from data without fairly compensating the people who produced it.
So just that, like colonial powers extracted resources from colonized lands, corporations are extracting data from us.
Exactly. We're constantly generating data, and corporations are profiting from it.
That's a disturbing thought. It makes you realize how much power these companies have over our lives.
It is unsettling. But the paper does offer some glimmers of hope.
Okay, I'm listening.
It highlights examples of communities resisting this data colonialism and finding ways to reclaim control of their data.
That's encouraging. It sounds like we can learn a lot from these communities about how to create a more equitable digital future.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we have a choice in how we shape the future of AI.
It's about realizing that we have power, even in the face of these giant tech companies.
Exactly. And this brings us to perhaps the most provocative point the paper makes, this idea that AI universalism, as it's practiced, actually narrows our view of humanity.
Wow, that's a strong statement. What do they mean by that?
They're arguing that this quest for artificial general intelligence, this idea that we can create an AI that knows everything, is actually leading us down a dangerous path.
What's so dangerous about that? Don't we want AI to be as intelligent as possible?
It's not that simple. The paper argues that this quest is driven by a data episteme.
A data episteme. Okay, what's that?
It's a way of seeing the world that prioritizes data above all else.
Okay.
It's this belief that we can only know something if we can measure it, quantify it, and analyze it with algorithms.
It's like we're trying to fit human experience into a spreadsheet.
Exactly, and we're losing something essential in the process.
So we're reducing people to just data points?
And this way of thinking is seeping into all aspects of our lives. It's how social media tracks our every move, how advertisers target us, how governments use algorithms for surveillance.
It's like we're living in a world where data is king and everything else, our emotions, our values, they don't matter.
And that can be incredibly dehumanizing, especially when AI is used to control human behavior.
Right. It's like we're becoming cogs in a giant machine.
And that's why the paper is calling for a different approach to AI, one that's more convivial.
Convivial AI. Okay, what does that mean?
It's about using technology to enhance human experience,
Okay.
not to control or diminish it.
So it's not about rejecting AI. It's about being more intentional about how we develop it.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming the human element in the age of AI.
It's about making sure technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been like an incredible start to our deep dive.
Right.
We've covered a lot of ground already.
We have.
From the limitations of AI's understanding of culture to the complexities of data bias and the need for a more convivial approach to technology.
It's fascinating to me how the humanities help us see AI in a whole new light, not just as a tool, but as a cultural object.
Yeah.
Something that reflects our values and shapes our world.
What stood out to you from all of this?
Well, this idea that bigger isn't always better in AI, that was really striking. It's a reminder that we need to be more critical about the hype and think about the trade-offs.
That's a great point. What about you? What resonated with you the most?
For me, it was the emphasis on context. The humanities are all about understanding the nuances of language and culture and history. And that's often missing from the world of AI.
Right, where data is treated as this neutral thing.
Exactly.
So the paper makes a strong case that we need to move beyond this data-driven approach and think more critically about the ethical dimensions of AI.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation we need to have now before it's too late.
That's a great point. The choices we make about AI today will have a huge impact on the future.
Yep.
Okay, well, we're not done yet. We'll continue this deep dive in our next episode where we'll explore some real-world examples of how the humanities are already changing the world of AI.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive, and remember, there's always more to learn.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
It's wild to think about all the stuff we just take for granted when it comes to AI.
Yeah.
That last segment really got me thinking about how our assumptions about AI are kind of shaped by this really techie way of looking at things.
Totally. It's like we forget that AI comes from human culture, and then it loops back and shapes that culture in new ways.
Right. And in this segment, we're going to get even more specific, looking at some of the ways that humanities researchers are actually pushing back against those limitations.
Yeah.
They're not just critiquing AI, they're actually offering alternative approaches.
Yeah. It's about saying, hey, hold on, let's think about this a bit more. Not just saying no to AI.
I'm ready for some examples. The paper mentioned a few projects that really caught my eye.
One that's super fascinating is the work being done with the HathiTrust Digital Library.
Oh, yeah, that's the one with millions of digitized books, right?
Yeah, over 17 million.
What are they doing with all that data?
So it's not just about training AI models. They're using these computational tools and human expertise to create really detailed metadata for each book.
Metadata meaning, information about the book?
Exactly. We're talking about genre classifications, publication dates, author bios, even things like the physical characteristics of the books themselves.
So they're capturing not just the words, but the whole context the book was created in.
Exactly. It's like giving each book its own little biography. And this allows researchers to ask all sorts of questions about the collection that they just couldn't answer before.
Like what kind of questions?
Well, they can track how literary genres have evolved over time,
Oh,
or
cool.
see how different cultural groups are represented in literature throughout history.
That's amazing. So they're not just digitizing books, they're creating a whole new way to understand human history.
Through the lens of literature, yeah.
What if we applied this same approach to other types of data? Like imagine the insights we could get if we had this level of detail for social media data or historical records.
That's a great point, and it highlights the need for more transparency in AI research. The paper actually talks about data sheets for data sets and a step in the right direction.
Remind me what that is again?
It's basically a framework for documenting key information about a data set.
Okay.
Things like the source of the data, how it was collected, what it's supposed to be used for, and any limitations or biases it might have.
So it's about being upfront about the fact that data has a history and a context.
Exactly. And the paper also talks about how humanities scholars are taking this even further with things like data archaeology, data narratives, and data essays.
Oh, yeah, those are so interesting. Can you remind me how those work?
Whereas data archaeology is all about digging into the past of a data set, tracing its origins and trying to figure out how it was shaped by different forces.
It's like recognizing that data isn't just this neutral, objective thing.
Right.
It has a history.
Exactly. Then you have data narratives, which try to put a human face on the data.
I like that.
It's about telling the stories of the people and communities that the data represents.
Making it real.
Exactly. And finally, you have data essays, which take a more analytical approach, exploring the broader implications of a data set.
So they're wrestling with the ethical and societal implications?
Precisely.
Okay.
And these data essays often draw on insights from multiple disciplines. It's not just computer scientists.
Right, it's like a team effort.
Exactly.
So it sounds like they're trying to bridge this gap between data and meaning, which is something we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And this attention to detail, this careful documentation of data is so important if we want to use AI responsibly.
It's about remembering that AI isn't some magical black box. It's a product of human choices.
With real-world consequences.
Right. And the paper highlights some really cool projects that are using AI in ways that are more aligned with like the values of the humanities.
Yeah.
Give me some examples.
One that I think is really interesting is this project by Giselle Gonzalez Garcia and Christian Whalebach, where they're customizing a large language model to help researchers study Irish migration.
How does that work?
They're basically training the AI to understand the specific language and historical context of Irish migration.
So it can actually help researchers analyze documents and stuff.
Exactly.
That's so cool.
And this type of specialized AI has the potential to totally revolutionize humanities research.
I can see that. What other projects are out there?
Another one that stands out is the work of Ted Underwood at UIUC.
Okay.
He and his team are training a large language model from scratch, using only 19th century English language writing.
So they're being really picky about the data they use.
Exactly. They're curating it to reflect a specific time period and style.
Why? What's the advantage of that?
What allows them to do some really cool things, like they can run what are called counterfactual experiments.
Counterfactual experiments, what are those?
It's basically asking what-if questions about history.
Oh, like what if this had happened instead of that?
Exactly. Like what if Charles Dickens had written science fiction instead of social realism?
That's a great example. So they can use AI to explore these alternative histories.
Exactly.
That's amazing. It's like using AI to rewrite history.
It is, and it's a great example of how AI can be used to deepen our understanding of the past.
Okay, I'm really liking this idea of smaller, more specialized AI models.
Yeah.
It just seems like a more thoughtful and responsible approach.
It's a shift away from that bigger is better mentality that we've seen for so long.
It's about being more intentional and focused.
Exactly.
And that requires a deeper understanding of human culture and values.
And that's where the humanities come in.
Right. It's not just about building AI that's bigger and faster. It's about building AI that reflects what it means to be human.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something we touched on earlier, openness in AI. As we said, it's not as simple as just making data freely available.
You're right. It gets complicated quickly when you start thinking about copyright and privacy and consent.
It's not just about whether we can use the data, but whether we should.
Exactly.
We need to think about the people and communities that the data represents.
We have to ask ourselves who owns this data? How was it collected? What are the potential consequences of using it?
Right. The paper talks about the dangers of archiving social media data related to protests like the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, that's a really sensitive topic.
Because that data could be used to identify and target people.
It's a reminder that data is not neutral.
Right, it can be used for good or for bad.
Exactly.
And that brings us to something related: synthetic data.
Have you heard much about that?
I've heard the term, but I don't really know what it is.
It's artificial data created to mimic real-world data.
So it's like a fake data set, but it still has the same characteristics as the real data.
Exactly. And it can be really useful when real data is scarce or sensitive or difficult to obtain. You can use synthetic data to train AI models without having to worry about some of the ethical concerns.
That makes sense. It's like building a model city to test out urban planning ideas before you make changes to a real city.
I like that analogy.
Hmm.
But it's important to remember that synthetic data is still just an approximation. It can't fully capture the nuances of the real world.
Right, so it's a tool that can be helpful, but we still need to be careful.
Absolutely. And speaking of being careful, another issue that often gets overlooked is the environmental impact of AI.
Oh, right. All those big AI models use a ton of energy.
A massive amount.
It's like we're so excited about what AI can do that we forget to ask what it costs.
Not just financially, but environmentally.
Exactly.
And if only giant corporations can afford to train these massive AI models, then we're basically locking in an approach that's unsustainable.
So we need to be thinking about more sustainable approaches to AI development.
Exactly.
Maybe those smaller, specialized AI models are a step in the right direction.
They could be. And there are other approaches being explored as well, like using more energy-efficient hardware and developing algorithms that are less computationally intensive.
So it's about finding ways to do more with less.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the issue of corporate control. We need to make AI research more accessible so that we can benefit from a wider range of ideas and approaches, including those that prioritize sustainability and social justice.
So it's about challenging the status quo and looking for alternatives.
Precisely. The paper highlights some inspiring examples like indigenous data futures and viral justice, which are all about community control of data.
It's a reminder that there are other ways of thinking about technology, ways that prioritize human values over profit.
Exactly. And those alternative approaches are out there. We just need to be open to them.
This has been another really thought-provoking conversation. I'm struck by how the humanities can help us see the limitations of AI and imagine a different path forward.
What stood out to you in this section?
I think what struck me most was this emphasis on collaboration. Bringing together different voices and perspectives to shape AI.
Yeah,
It's not just about the tech, it's about the people.
absolutely. It's about building a future where AI is used to empower humanity, not to control it.
And what about you? What resonated with you the most?
I was really fascinated by those examples of how AI is being used to deepen our understanding of history and culture. It reminds us that AI can be a tool for exploration and discovery.
It's about expanding our knowledge, not just automating tasks.
Exactly.
Okay, so in our final segment, let's try to bring all of this together and imagine what a more human-centered approach to AI might actually look like in practice.
I'm looking forward to that.
Stay tuned for the exciting conclusion of the deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive.
We're in the final stretch now of our exploration of AI and the humanities.
It's been quite a journey.
It has.
We've challenged some assumptions about AI and discovered how the humanities can offer this fresh perspective.
We've seen some really cool examples of how humanities researchers are using AI in these creative and thoughtful ways.
Yeah, so the big question is, where do we go from here? What does a human-centered approach to AI actually look like?
Well, the paper doesn't offer a simple solution, but it does give us some directions to think about.
Okay, I'm all ears.
One key takeaway for me is that we need to move beyond this narrow, techie view of AI.
Right, we need to start seeing AI as a cultural artifact.
Yeah, a reflection of our values, a force that's shaping the world.
It's like AI is this powerful lens that we're using to understand ourselves and the world, but we need to make sure we're not looking through a distorted lens.
Exactly. And that means engaging with the social and ethical implications of AI, not just the technical capabilities.
So we need to be asking questions like, who benefits from this technology? Who might be harmed? Are we creating a future that's fair and just for everyone?
Yeah, those are the big questions.
Right, and it seems like from this paper, AI isn't neutral.
Not at all.
It's shaped by the data we feed it, the models we build, the choices we make about how we use it.
All of that.
It's like weaving a tapestry. But the threads we choose, the patterns we create, they all reflect our values and our biases.
And if we're not careful, those biases can get amplified in ways that really harm people.
The paper made a really strong case for being more mindful of these power dynamics, especially when we're using data from marginalized communities.
It's about making sure everyone has a seat at the table when we're making decisions about AI.
Yeah, and recognizing that expertise comes in many forms.
Exactly.
We need to value the knowledge of humanities, scholars, social scientists, artists, community members, not just the tech experts.
Collaboration is key.
If we want to create AI that serves humanity, we need all those voices at the table.
Couldn't agree more.
One of the most intriguing ideas from the paper is this concept of convivial AI.
I love that term.
Me too. Can you remind me what it means again?
It's this idea that technology should be designed to enhance human experience, not control it or diminish it.
Right. So AI that's aligned with our values that helps us live better lives.
Imagine AI that helps us connect with each other more deeply. Fosters creativity, helps us solve problems.
It's a powerful vision, and it requires us to rethink what AI is actually for.
We need to stop thinking about it as just a tool for automation and start imagining it as a partner.
I like that, a partner in creating a better world.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the paper also looks at historical examples of resistance and collective action.
Oh, interesting.
Like movements for social justice or environmental protection.
Yeah.
These movements show us that people have the power to challenge systems and create change.
It's about taking back control and demanding that technology serves us.
Exactly. We have a choice in how we shape the future.
This deep dive has really made me think differently about AI.
Me too. It's clear that the humanities have so much to offer when it comes to guiding us toward a more ethical future for this technology.
So as we wrap up, what's your biggest takeaway? What's the one thing you hope people listening will remember?
For me, it's the importance of staying curious and critical. Don't just accept the hype around AI. Ask questions, demand better.
I love that. What about you? What's your key message for our listeners?
I'd say it's the power of imagination. We can't just react to what's happening with AI. We need to actively imagine the future we want to create.
Not just predict the future, but create it.
Exactly. And that takes all of us.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into AI and the humanities.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope this conversation has given you a lot to think about.
And we hope you'll continue the conversation. Ask questions, demand accountability, and work together to build a future where technology truly serves humanity.
That's what it's all about. Thanks for listening. And remember, there's always more to learn.